your realm of expertise is so fascinating to me. The amount of time that I walk around in the day and just wonder what's real and what's happening. And then thinking back to when I was a kid and looking up to the sky and thinking to myself, it goes on for infinity. But what is at the end of infinite? Nothing, it doesn't, I can't, oh, my brain. Is that what you did when you were a kid? Did you look up at the sky and just go, I need to know?
Yeah, I mean, that's how I got into science. It was astronomy, just like you, just looking up at the night sky. Something captured my imagination. And fortunately for me, I made the connection. I thought, well, actually learning about these points of light and what they are is science. And so I started paying attention at school to science because I wanted to know about astronomy and also science fiction. Actually, I grew up, Star Wars was the huge thing when I was 9, 10 years old. And so I connected all that as well and thought it's all the same thing. And I want to know more about it. And that's the wonderful thing about astronomy, as you say, is the more you learn about those points of light in the sky, the more wonderful they become. In the morning at the moment, the planets are up kind of early morning. And Jupiter, for example, if you look at that just through a pair of binoculars or a small telescope, you see the moons. And then you realize that one of those moons, Europa, has an ocean below its surface, which has got more water than all the oceans of the Earth combined.
Is the size of Europa similar to Earth?
It's smaller. It's kind of almost a small planet sized. So it's smaller than the Earth, but it's just water beneath the surface. I was at JPL a few weeks ago, actually, where they build the space probes. And they're building a thing called Europa Clipper now, which is going to go to that moon. And one of the reasons is because it's one of our prime candidates for life. So then the point of light that you're looking at might have life on it or in the ocean, and off you go.
Did that also make you wonder when you looked out to the sky whether or not there were other entities out there too?
Well, yeah. And, microbes might be really common. So we're also, as we speak, there's a rover called Perseverance on Mars, which is now in a river delta. It's just arrived, an ancient river delta. And it's taking samples below the surface because 3.5 billion years ago, that surface was underwater. And so we want to know whether there are signs of life. And the most amazing thing about that mission is that Perseverance, the rover, is the first bit. So it's packaging up samples and it's going to leave them on the surface of Mars. And then the next thing, another mission is going to go and land another lander on Mars, which is going to go and collect the samples, put them in a rocket. And the rocket is going to be, believe it or not, catapulted up off the surface. And then they're going to light the rocket and it's going to fly into orbit around Mars. And then they're going to send another mission, which is going to go and find this thing, which has got the samples in it, which is only about the size of a baseball. And then it's going to find it in orbit around Mars, get it, and then bring it back to Earth. And ultimately, it's going to crash land in Utah in the deserts. And then they're going to go and find that and bring it back to the laboratory to look for signs of life on Mars. It's the most incredible. It's called Mars Sample Return. And the more you talk about it, the more crazy.
Right. That does sound like quite the choreographed mission. I've heard you talking about this before and thinking that maybe there's going to be information in those samples, in those core samples, to how life began, and it might help us understand how our life began. Is that accurate?
Yeah. The interesting thing about Mars is that if life began on Mars, it probably began around the same time that it began on Earth. So 3.5, 4 billion years ago. But on Earth, sort of kind of paradoxically, it's much harder to look back in time because Earth's active. It's got weather, it's got volcanoes, plate tectonics, all this stuff. So the surface is constantly being renewed. And so it's very, very hard to get samples from Earth of Earth as it was 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. It's almost impossible. Whereas on Mars, it stopped being geologically active about 3.5 billion years ago. So it's been in deep freeze. And so these river deltas that Perseverance is roving across now are pristine river deltas from 3.5 billion years ago. They're time capsules. So it might be easier to understand the origin of life if it began on Mars. It might be much easier to do so than it is on our own planet.
How far down are those?
The water now is way deeper. But this was surface water 3.5 billion years ago.
Yeah.
So the idea is that if there were microbes in that river delta, then their remains or the traces they've left will be just below the surface. And that's why we're taking these samples to bring back to Earth.
So, okay. So if we can look back to that time and say, maybe this is an indication of how life started, would it be far-fetched to think that if we just look to how we're doing it right now to find life, that that's just how life started then too? So like extraterrestrials or somebody, you're finding another planet to live on. Could it just be someone from another planet coming to figure out and like, oh, look here, this is how it started. Somebody visited and said, this looks like a nice home.
It's one of the big questions we have about the origin of life is, of course, how often did it happen in a solar system like ours? It obviously happened here. Or did it? Because we know that material is transferred between the planets. So we have Martian meteorites on the Earth. We have bits of the Earth on Mars, although we've not found them, but because bits of Mars land on Earth, we assume that bits of Earth land on Mars. And so it's not completely impossible that life began once on Earth or Mars and got transferred. And so the first thing we want to know, if we find signs of life on Mars, is it the same? So does it look, does it have DNA? Is it in some sense the same as the life on Earth, or is it different? So was there a different genesis? How many different ways are there of being alive? We don't know, because we have only one example, which is Earth. Right. So these are profound questions. And then to go on to your next question, then you start saying, well, but what's the chance that given microbes, the origin of life, little cells or something like that, what are the chances of those cells ultimately getting together into things like you and me, which are these hugely complex things, the most complex things we know of anywhere in the universe, the things that can have a conversation, right, and think and feel and bring meaning to the universe in a very real sense. And all we know, again, is that it took about over 3 billion years from the origin of life on Earth to get anything more complex than a single cell. It's about 3 billion years. It's a quarter of the age of the universe. And so what I talk about in the live show actually is if I was to guess, and we don't know, but if I was to guess how many civilizations there are in a galaxy like the Milky Way, with 400 billion suns and countless trillions of planets, I'd guess there might be a handful, maybe even one, which is us. I think the chances of civilizations appearing on planets, it's a big ask when you think about it, isn't it? I mean, to think, it's one thing to have some chemicals getting together and turning into a cell and it's a living thing, and it's a huge deal. That it's a big thing in itself. Yeah. But then the idea that those cells decide to collaborate together and build spaceships is a whole other question.
Right. And create these complex missions to get things off Mars. Yeah. So then would it be accurate to say that if you thought that there could be a handful or even one civilization in a galaxy, that there would be one to a handful in every galaxy?
The Milky Way is not that atypical that we know of. Our estimate, by the way, for the number of galaxies in the piece of the universe we can see, which is called the observable universe, is 2 trillion. Right? 2 trillion.
That's a lot of neighbors that are not real close.
So I think the Milky Way is fairly typical. We don't really see anything that's massively unusual. So I think that I'm sure, as sure as I can be, that there are civilizations out there somewhere in the universe. But the question really, if we want to ever meet them, or we really want to, see extraterrestrial life, the question is how many are in our neighborhood? And I'm being loose with the word neighborhood because the Milky Way galaxy is 150,000 light years across or something like that, with 400 billion suns. So it's big, but let's say that's our neighborhood. Imagine if we're the only one in there. There's quite a responsibility we have, I would say, if that's the case. I was asked to give the intro, the COP26 climate summit. So it was quite an honor, actually. They said to me, what would you say to the world leaders? If you've got one message to them about the progress we need to make of climate, what would it be? And I said this. I said that as far as I know, it's a possibility at least. So let's say it's our operating premise that we are the only civilization in the Milky Way galaxy at the moment. That means that this planet, this little speck of dust, notwithstanding its physical insignificance, is almost indescribably valuable, because it could be the only place where atoms have got together to think and feel, and in a very deep sense, bring meaning to the universe. Because I would argue that you need things as complex as human brains. You need thoughts to have meaning. And so if you collectively, world leaders, through inaction or deliberate action, remove us from this world, then you may be responsible for eliminating meaning in a galaxy of 400 billion stars, potentially forever. That's the responsibility that you have. And that's an example of why I think that science is so valuable. It's not because it has the answers to everything. We don't have the answers to everything. Science is fundamentally a humble pursuit. It's based on the idea that we don't know everything. Therefore, we try to find out and do research. But it does give us perspective. My great hero, Carl Sagan, said that astronomy is a humbling and character-building experience. So it's humbling because it tells us that we're tiny, it's a speck of dust. But it's character building because it says that we might also be extremely valuable and we might underestimate our cosmic significance. So we have a tremendous responsibility. I think it's a good working assumption. And I don't think that, the more world leaders and our politicians, the more perspective they have, and the more they understand the potential tragedy of damaging this world. I think that I really do think the better they behave. They just need to do a bit of astronomy. In fact, I'd launch them into space. People talk about commercial space. Maybe we'll talk about it. But one of the great benefits for me would be to launch every world leader into space before they start, so they can look at the Earth from space and get a sense of its beauty and fragility, and ultimately, I think, its significance. And then we can choose. Maybe we can vote which ones to bring back. But broadly speaking, I'd bring most of them back again. Exactly. And just say, there you go. Now you've seen what you are responsible for.